So turn to Nick. He is Global Head of Aid and Relief Services at DHL Global Forwarding.
Thank you. So thanks everyone and welcome. It's certainly a passion for me with humanitarian logistics. I've now been in it, well, started off in 2002, very green, and yes, slowly progressed through where we go to. I come from, I suppose, a very practical background. I grew up on a farm in New Zealand, spent a lot of time around machinery, mechanics, things like that. Spent my university holidays driving trucks and working in workshops and things like that. At the same time, I also have studied an undergraduate degree in transport and logistics, and most recently finished 2010, 2011 was a master's from Cranfield here in logistics and supply chain management. So what I've tried to do, and please excuse it's pretty poor editing, I just to perhaps give a bit of background in my humanitarian experience, is put together a short video. So this was in Pakistan with a helicopter drop scenario. We were moving supplies into areas where we couldn't get to by trucks with helicopters, so using helicopters and things like that. It was after the Pakistan earthquake, so you can see some of the damage and things that we had to deal with in the roads. And again, from a logistical point of view, all the different challenges that come along. This was our warehouse setup that we had in Pakistan, in the affected areas. I think it was about 10 different tents. Well, again, it's very different to running a warehouse in the first world, and so I very rarely worked in one that's had a forklift. But I think this just want to illustrate is that the importance of logistic is that these people waiting for things, they may have been there all day waiting, so if it's late, they're in the sun. It's very difficult to ask them and say, oh well, we couldn't do it today, we'll come back tomorrow. Many of them have probably travelled a long distance. One of the reasons for using this particular truck that was based around it was because it was enabled us to get further off the main roads, so perhaps the beneficiaries didn't have to travel quite as far. But just a final few things, just in terms of just looking at some of the different things. That I started off in Malawi, very green. Got a job after sort of waiting 2 years for the New Zealand Red Cross, and turned up to manage 60 trucks and the same number of drivers and all through Malawi, and that was sort of an eye-opener and slowly building up a way. Very interesting approach in the sense that I think at one stage I had 4 fuel contracts in running, ranging from ones that were handwritten on a piece of A4 on the front of my vehicle, car at the local fuel station, to handshakes to phone conversations. And I've spent time in Niger, again with these trucks, and then moved into Pakistan for a year and a half. Initially just running the fleet, but then taking over as a logistics operation in the second winter after the earthquake. Bangladesh, was based in Dubai for 2 years as regional logistics coordinator. And then after I left the Red Cross, was involved in a short project, which meant I spent a month in Sudan, with a week of it in Darfur, looking at the supply chain that was feeding supplies into there. And since being involved in DHL, responsible for their commercial humanitarian operations. And just recently here in London, trying to set up a social networking group, if you like, of people who are interested in humanitarian logistics to come along once a month and have a discussion and talk to people, share experiences, perhaps listen to a speaker that might expand on the horizons of humanitarian logistics a bit. And so we're just slowly getting that off the ground, so meeting once called the Last Mile Club. And before I carry on, just a small disclaimer, a lot of what I want to speak about today is based on my personal experience and some of my thoughts. I would say not all of it necessarily is exactly the same along as DHL's approach to it and things like that, and hopefully I can give you a bit wider presentation. We talk about the 5 rights in logistics: right place, right time, all these different things. I think the first quote, like in humanitarian context, they know they want to move something, but they don't know when, where. They do know when they wanted to move it, which was yesterday, and as I say, it's constantly changing. And while I think that's common within a lot of supply chains, that's also the thing. The flexibility that's required is a challenge. At the end of the day, the best logistics managers in this game are the guys who are working with very limited information, will make a decision and move on and make things happen and be able to solve it with what resources that means. And maybe that means, from a personal experience, I remember looking for trucks, and it came down to, we managed to get a few trucks in, but it was a truck that pulled in to offload, and I saw the telephone number of the company that he was working for, and he was subcontractor. First thing I did was phone that guy and say, what have you got in trucks? And it's that sort of practical, just seeing what's on the ground and what's happening. If we look at the humanitarian supply chain, I've also broken it into 3 different categories. One is the supply, which is more around procurement and supply of goods. In the humanitarian sector, you'll sometimes hear numbers like 80% of humanitarian disaster response is around logistics. The number's that high usually because it includes the procurement of the goods. When you start just looking at the cost of moving goods, it's probably a lot lower. And then you may be familiar with the aspects around first mile and last mile. So if we were just to look at the supply side, traditionally it was all very much direct from supplier. The organisation would make an order with a supplier, and then the goods would be shipped from that supplier. But as times have changed and looking and going towards the supply chain management, people have said, well, how can we improve it or have better availability of goods and everything like that? One of the challenges with the direct supplier in an emergency is that it's getting supplies, having enough supplies. So some of the organisations have started to look at pre-positioning stock. So A, they have availability straight away, but B, it also reduces the cost of transport because they may be closer together. So if you take someone like the Red Cross, they now have regional storage hubs in Panama, Dubai, Kuala Lumpur, plus a few sub-regional ones where they hold stock. Some of the stock they own, some of it is owned by the supplier until it's actually used. Now the advantage with that is that if it's take example of Haiti, rather than having to ship the goods from India or China, where most of the suppliers come from, they're actually able to ship them initially, the first wave, the quick response, out of Panama directly. Looking at the first mile, I'd say it's relatively simple, bar one thing, is having the capacity to move it. As I say, most commercial logistician or commercial logistics freight, they don't run anything if they're not running it at near full capacity. It doesn't make sense. So suddenly in an emergency where you've got a massive spike in demand, looking for that, where's that capacity available from? Obviously it'd be great to be able to use the same rates and everything that you can ship there on a regular basis, but when everyone's demanding that and the demand's massive, you then got to find extra capacity. Usually in an emergency, that first point comes from the ability, air charter. But if you look at something where it might cost you $500,000 for one aircraft to fly halfway around the world with a load, it's a very expensive commodity. If we look at the last mile, which in many ways is the most challenging because it's the most diverse, constantly changing environment, you don't know where it's going to be, damaged infrastructure, multiple components, so there's very few situations where there's an organisation that can provide all the trucking capacity, all the warehouses and everything around. Whereas in an humanitarian operation, the warehouse might run for a month. It goes flat out for a month and then it closes down because it's no longer needed there. So that sort of flexibility, and as you saw in the video, a lot of them are tents. Take about 2 to 3 days to put up and ready to go straight away sort of thing. So that's a quick way of getting warehouse storage in place. So it's really important that you have the local knowledge of A, what the capacity is, but also what is local, I suppose, market work, how does it work, how do things get paid for. But I'd have to say probably for me, and people often talk about what defines this the most, or defines logistics the most, or humanitarian logistics, and a lot of it for me comes around the customs, or that's where there's a really challenging environment. Because in most situations, humanitarian aid goes in duty-free or tax-free. They need exemptions. But it's not, very few governments will open their doors and just say, bring it, let it come. Anything can come in. I think there was a point Pakistan earthquake where basically you could bring aid in and it was just driving out of the airport. Now that might last for a week, and then all of a sudden everything closes down and it's suddenly, so you've still got to do the customs process, but to get it duty exempted you will need some sort of exemption, the signatures and everything to get it signed off. As I say, the challenges, demurrage, we talk about just the whole unpredictability. No one knows where the next disaster is necessarily going to occur. All of a sudden it occurs and you've got to create a supply chain out of nothing. That's very much one-off. You can't test ideas necessarily. It's a case of it's got to go and work from day one. I would also, one of the other challenges around it is often to do with public procurement. Everything within the sector is done through public procurement policies, or a large part of it. So it's very much driven by 3 quotations, everything like that, having a very structured approach, which means it can take a bit of time to process, and hence one of the reasons a lot of organisations now use frameworks for their key items so they can get them fast. But it's also, it's an interesting way to, it's a challenging sometimes environment to work in. And again, as I said, I'll go back to that point about practical solutions in terms of being able to find the truck to do that final delivery, or finding a warehouse where you need to store goods. And as I say, getting stuff on time means trying to get it there a couple of days early before the distribution. So I remember in Pakistan we would often use schools. Local school deliver the food bags to the school, and then you've got security. But quite often you could be able to go and talk to the local chief, and he would arrange security for you, and those sorts of things. So it's sometimes finding these local solutions and practical solutions. One of the other areas that I think has a big role in this is around what I call circular versus linear supply chains. Most supply chains that we live with on a daily are very circular. And what I mean by that is the person who's buying the goods and the person who's receiving the goods are very close together, if not the same person. As opposed to what I would classify most humanitarian supply chains as being very linear, in terms of the person who purchases the goods compared to the person who receives the goods is a long, long way away geographically, demographically, everything. So, as a supply chain manager or provider, which end of the supply chain is your focal point? Who are you wanting to give the most benefit to? Now, true humanitarians say, of course, the beneficiaries. But then again, this is where your money comes from. So you've got to make sure that they're providing what they require. And again, because the feedback loop is so long, the supply chain requires a lot of or takes a lot of that load of providing that information. And then just finally, I think the other side of it is looking at terms of its responsiveness. Obviously in a response or in a very much event-based scenario, we're very much looking for an agile and flexible supply chain. To the point of, yes, I need an aircraft and I need it to go there. At the moment, this is what I'm putting on it. But if my team in the field comes back in the next hour and says, we don't need that, we need this, we want the flexibility to be able to put that on. Or, okay, at the moment it's landing here, but we think that airport's going to be okay, but they're still checking it. So it may have to land over here, or we may have to use a smaller aircraft, or we may have a lot more stuff we want to move. So it needs to be very flexible and agile. And for me in the commercial sector, that's a real challenge, because I want something very solid, very fixed. As opposed to something on a program or an operational support, it's very much a lean, looking for something that's very lean, very cheap, but very reliable. So if we move into the stakeholders, and again, I think it touches a wee bit on where we were with the circular and linear. Within a humanitarian supply chain, there's a huge range of stakeholders involved in this. Some that you see very easily, some that you don't see so much. We talk about, obviously, the beneficiary. Now, of course, that can be very diverse, and one of the challenges that's coming through in different environments, and probably more so, is the difference in what their expectations as a beneficiary are. So if you're delivering aid into a very much a rural village that hasn't had a lot of so-called creature comforts, their expectations may be not the same. As someone where you take, for example, refugees coming out of Syria who have lived at had a substantially higher standard of living, if you like, and their expectations. What they're used to is different. So there's a real broad range of what has to be delivered to there. So when you're delivering something in an emergency, life-saving can in some ways have a very different context. So the final bit, and this was just sort of putting together a few things in terms of market trends, is probably a bit wider scope, but just to sort of say, well, firstly, I think the big turning point, the recognised big turning point in logistics, humanitarian logistics, has been the 2004 Asian tsunami. It really became clear what the impact of logistics was, both in terms of reaching these goods, poor logistics, the whole idea of having regional hubs, and that didn't really exist before the tsunami, the Asian tsunami. So there was a lot of goods that were flying from Europe down there at huge expense in terms of managing stock. Professionalism, leadership and training. Thankfully there's been a big change in that. There's a lot of programs about training, either training skills or recognising existing skills. A lot of people, as I say, in the humanitarian sector fell into logistics, have a huge experience but no qualifications. So how do you bring them through, but also taking people from being logisticians to supply chain managers. But I think the other point that sometimes I get is you get a lot of people who say, oh well, I've just done my Masters in Humanitarian Logistics, I'm ready to go into the field, I've read all this, I've worked in warehouses and things like this, and you look at CVs and you say, well yeah, okay, yeah, you might have worked in a warehouse, but that was a very automated distribution type warehouse. Do you know what a stock card is? Do you know how to fill a stock card and hire a truck? At the end of the day, the humanitarian logistics is very basic. In an emergency, you need people, as one of the colleagues would say, who can walk a file through the long room, walk a file through customs, work with customs, know how to get that file from when it goes in the door to the goods being cleared. So I think I've run a fair bit over my time, so I'll stop there.